Hello, welcome to the Artistic Spirit podcast. Today I'm here with Brett Talley. I'll just do an introduction. Brett J. Talley is the podcast co-host of The Prosecutors, and it was named Podcast Creator of the Year at the 2023 CrimeCon CLUE Awards. He is the author of several acclaimed horror novels, short stories, and collections. Twice nominated for the Bram Stoker Award. Welcome, Brett.
I am so honored to be here, Katie. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited for this one. So let's just jump right into it. So building an audience and growing a podcast or writing can be challenging. What strategies have you used to connect with your audience and build a dedicated following? And how has social media played a role in your success? And specifically, what would you say as advice for someone starting out who wants to connect with their audience and build a community?
Well, I think it's the hardest thing. It's by far the hardest part. If you want to be a creator, if you want to put content out there, it's actually getting it in people's ears or getting them to watch it. And we all know you're fighting against the fact that there are so many other people out there, and you're fighting against algorithms, and you're fighting against everything else. And I think you've sort of put your finger on it. I think the most important thing you can do is be available and engaging with your audience. And you may say, well, how do you even get an audience in the first place? You just have to start small and you have to be patient. I think the most important thing, really, that anyone who wants to do this has to know is that it may take a while. You may be putting out some of the best stuff you can imagine, doing fantastic research, releasing wonderful episodes on whatever the topic is that you care about. And it just seemed like it's just not happening, or growth is really slow, or it's a trickle, or any number of other things like that. When we started our podcast, we basically said we are going to make really good stuff. We're going to do the best we can. We're going to put it out there. We're going to create some social media handles. We're going to start to engage. We're going to talk to other people who are involved. I mean, I think one of the most important things you can do is find other people who are doing what you're doing and reach out to them. The biggest ones in the world are probably not going to respond to you because they're probably pretty busy, but you'll be surprised. If you just reach out to people, you will be really surprised at how many people will answer you, will give you advice, will help you, might have you on their show. And that was really the way that we started to build things. We were putting out good stuff. Small numbers of people were finding it. They were telling their friends. That starts some organic growth. We're also appearing on shows talking about cases. In our case, it's a true crime podcast, so talking about cases. And through that, people are seeing us and they're hearing us and they think, oh, they're interesting. And so then they're starting to listen. And really, it's the organic growth that you want to develop. I don't think anybody who tells you there's a one size fits all approach to this stuff, I think, is wrong. I'm not going to say never spend money on advertising, but a lot of folks who are just starting out, number one, don't have money to spend on advertising and wouldn't know how to do it in the first place. And frankly, advertising that just goes into the void for something nobody's ever heard of anyway is not really that effective. Advertising can be a really good way to boost growth, but I don't know that it can start it. So I think that's one mistake people make, is they want to invest heavily on advertising in the beginning. And I don't think that's it. I think you got to get out there and build. And it can be small. I mean, the way growth happens is you get 10 people listen to your podcast and they tell 10 friends. All of a sudden you've doubled your audience. And if you double your audience enough, all of a sudden you got a pretty big audience. And so the most important thing is that when someone listens to you or sees you or reads you, they're hooked and they're grabbed and they want to tell their friends who have similar ideas. And a lot of these people will be in groups that read books or groups that listen to podcasts, and they'll mention you when people ask, hey, I'm looking for a new thing. So I think that's the most important thing. And you have to be available. So be on Twitter, be on Facebook, be on TikTok, whatever it is that you like to do. And you don't have to do everything. I personally just don't even understand TikTok. I'm sure TikTok would be a super powerful tool for us, but we don't use it because we don't really understand it. So do what you're comfortable with, but do it. And if you are talking to people and responding to people, then they'll start to feel a connection to you. And those personal connections can go so far.
I love that. I think that's so important for people to think about before they start. So I think this question will help some people out there. You and Alice, your co-host for The Prosecutors, had the idea to do a true crime podcast for years before starting. What would you tell to someone who has an idea but hasn't taken any action on creating it yet?
Well, I think it is, number one, Be realistic about what you're getting into, because if you really want to do it and you want to do it consistently, and it's fine, there is nothing wrong with saying, you know what, I just want to write a book. I just want to write one book. If I never write another book, that's fine. Or I just want to do a few podcast episodes on something that really matters to me. Or there's a subject that I'm really passionate about. Do it. But if you want to do it consistently, if you're thinking, I want to do something that I want to do for the next few years, know that it's going to be a lot of work. Know what it's going to take. Look into it, research it. But don't allow any of that to intimidate you or dissuade you, because the beautiful thing about media today is it's not like it used to be. There are no gatekeepers anymore. 70 years ago, unless you just so happened to be singing in the right club when the right producer walked in, you were never going to have a record deal, right? Today, you can release a video on YouTube and all of a sudden you're Lana Del Rey or whatever, right? I mean, the ability to reach millions of people without having to go through those gatekeepers is there. So don't be intimidated and don't think you can't do it, because tons of people just like you have done it. Alice and I, when we started the podcast, we're both lawyers. We were both prosecutors. We do this every day. This is the kind of stuff we do, and we were passionate about it. Alice wasn't really into the true crime side of things, but I was. I listened to a lot of true crime podcasts, and I thought, there's a gap there. There are a lot of great true crime podcasts out there, but there aren't a lot of great true crime podcasts with lawyers. And I didn't know if there were any true crime podcasts out there with prosecutors. Even if they were lawyers, they tended to be defense attorneys, which we love those guys, but they come at it from a different perspective. And I was telling Alice, I really feel like we could do something here. This could be big, but we had to think about it because, like the same things that dissuade a lot of people from doing stuff dissuaded us, self-doubt. That's a huge one, right?
Mm-hmm.
What if we're terrible? Like we like to tell people when we first did it, you talk about how this is probably not how to build an audience. When we first did it, we didn't tell any of our friends or any of our family, because we were like, just in case this just doesn't work out at all, we can just sort of like hide it away. Like this never really happened. We'll just ignore it, right? But that's we had that same self-doubt that everybody has. We didn't go into this thinking this is a slam dunk guarantee. And it took a while, and it took a global pandemic to wrench us out of our malaise and decide we're going to do this. Don't let that be you. Be braver than we are, because once we started doing it, because we had thought about it, we knew what it was going to take. We had already, before we recorded our first episode, we'd already done a lot of research on a lot of different cases. Because one thing I'm sure you see when you're releasing a podcast or a show and you're doing it at a regular basis, it can be tough when you're like, man, I got to do something for next week. And then the next week, like I've got to have something ready. Building some of that, back catalog up was good, but we also had really thought about the space we were going to get into, and we had identified something that we could add. And this is not a necessary thing. Another thing I would say, don't let anybody tell you, look, there's already 1 million true crime podcasts, or there's already 1,000 this book, or 1,000 this YouTube channel. Why would you want to do it? Don't let anybody tell you that, because number one, who cares? And number two, you have something to add. Every single person out there has some unique thing to add. Whether you know it or not, you do. Whether it's just your perspective and your unique life experiences. And we identified a pretty big thing we thought we had, the whole prosecutorial angle, and really dove into that. And we called it the Prosecutors for a reason. And it worked. And I think because we had identified that is one of the reasons we were able to grow it. But I guess my biggest piece of advice is, know that success is not going to be instant or even in the near term, and don't necessarily do it because you want, to have a million downloads or 1 million views or whatever. You also need to have something else about it that you like too, because success is great and everybody loves success, but there's going to be times, especially in the early period, where if you don't enjoy it, or you don't really like what you're talking about, or you don't get joy out of it or joy out of your co-host, where you're going to stop. So make sure that you have as much passion as you do planning.
Yeah, it's so hard. I can't tell you how hard it is to not take notes as I'm listening to you, because there's so many great nuggets that I just want to go back for. So I'm glad I'll be writing show notes after this, so I will have a chance to take notes. but also you've been recognized with awards and nominations for your work. How do you handle criticism and rejection in your creative pursuits? And what advice can you offer to aspiring writers and podcast hosts on dealing with setbacks? And what would you say to someone who's afraid to start because of these things?
Well, I think number one, your fear is justified in that if you do it, someone will criticize you. That's just the way it is. I think one thing we all should do as creators and listeners and everything else is remember that when we're being critical of other people, because it's really easy to be critical.
Mm-hmm.
And every person that you're critical of, there's a human being behind that who's doing their best. And just remember that. And I think we could do with a lot less criticism, particularly, we talked about what's good about the internet and what's good about social media and how it removes all these barriers and allows all this stuff to happen. But it also has opened the door to a lot of bullying and a lot of hateful attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to come. And I think one thing you have to recognize is the negative voices will always be the loudest. Always. For every one person who is, sending you nasty direct messages, there are 10 people who really enjoy what you're doing and just never let you know. And that's just the way it is. And it's just a fact. And that's another thing. If you like stuff, let people know because hearing positive feedback is really important. Because the other thing that's true is for every 10 comments you get that make you feel good, it's always the one that makes you feel bad that you remember. So you need that positive stuff. And I will say this, and it doesn't matter how successful the person is, how big their audience is, they will appreciate a kind word from you. So if you got somebody out there that you really enjoy, let them know. That's the first thing. The second thing, don't let it stop you, but be prepared for it and know how to respond to it. The first thing you have to deal with is rejection, particularly if it's something like writing. So I've written books. Podcast is easy because no one can reject it because you just get to put it out there, right? You don't have to get an agent, you don't have to get anybody to publish it. When I was writing books, my first book, I must have sent that thing to, I don't know, every agent under the sun, right? And it was a horror novel. It was in horror. And the great thing about horror is it's a passionate community. I love horror. I think it's an amazing area to read and to work in. The bad thing about horror is the audience is pretty small. It's one of the smallest audiences for literature out there. So there aren't a lot of agents who are going to take it. And I didn't know that. So I'm like sending off to agents and getting rejected left and right. And every now and then I would get like a letter back from an agent that would say something nice, that would actually say like, hey, I read this and really liked it, but we don't really do horror, but you should keep at it. Right. Which was, once again, that was a really nice thing. And then finally, basically, as I was saying, you just got to keep at it. I started sending it off to competitions, and eventually it won a competition. That's how it got published. And then it was nominated for the Bram Stoker Award, which is, the highest award in horror or whatever. And that was great. And that was a huge accomplishment for me. And it really made me happy and built me up. But then, it's like everything else. You got to write the next book, right? And you got to do the next book. And you just have to, and you always will be plagued by self-doubt. Your biggest critic is not going to be the people out there who are yelling at you. Though that's something to worry about. The person you have to really get hold of is yourself, because you are always going to doubt what you're doing. No matter how good it is, no matter how many people are telling you how great it is, you will be your biggest critic. So you have to get control of yourself. And as you can block the troll on Twitter, and you can ignore 1-star reviews on Apple, but you can't get away from you. So I think one thing, sometimes I wonder if when people talk about the criticism and dealing with the hate and everything, if really they're worried about their own insecurities and how their own insecurity is going to manifest when they see that. And that's really the core of it. You have to believe in yourself and be comfortable with yourself, and just know you're not perfect, and you're never going to be perfect, and nothing you do is ever going to be perfect, and you're never going to be universally beloved, and that's fine. And remember why you're doing it. Like we talked about before, like what is the reason you're doing this? Was it so that everyone on Twitter would tell you how great you were? I bet it wasn't. I bet that was not why you went out there to do it, particularly if one of the things keeping you from doing it is the fear of the reaction. You know, I don't think anybody who is worried about the criticism they're going to receive on social media is doing it for social media glory. I mean, maybe they are, but that would be a little ironic, right? So remember why you're doing it and focus on that, and focus on your own inner critic who keeps telling you that it's not good enough, because that can be great motivation as long as that's what it is. As long as it's motivation to keep doing better and keep, making the best stuff you can, that's great. But when it becomes, why am I even doing this? I should just quit. That's when it becomes a problem.
Yeah, I have a question. What was your why with the Prosecutors?
So my why with the Prosecutors was I was passionate about true crime. I just love it. I mean, it's one of those things I just enjoyed so much. And I've always been a fan. There's a reason I wrote horror novels and I do a true crime podcast. I love mysteries. I love the unknown, and I like delving into it. And true crime sort of grew out naturally from my love of horror and the paranormal and the unexplained and all that stuff. And then with true crime, you have these sort of real life scenarios. And my favorite true crime are unexplained ones, mysteries, the old Unsolved Mysteries show. Any of you guys are old enough to remember that with Robert Stack. It was like when I was a kid, if I stayed over with my grandparents, we were watching Unsolved Mysteries, and I loved it. And so for me, it was diving into that, not having to rely so much on what somebody else was saying about it, but to dive into the evidence for myself and see if I could figure it out, and then to share that with people. I've always been somebody, I like to share with people. I like to create things. So that was the why for me. I wanted to do that. And it was one of the reasons that, I mean, look, if somebody doesn't like an episode, if somebody's criticizing an episode, well, that's fine. I enjoyed making it. I enjoyed looking into it. I learned something from it. I got a lot out of it. I just produced a true crime episode I always wanted to listen to. Right. And so the criticism, while it can get annoying, and obviously, you never want to be criticized, it just doesn't affect me maybe so much as it might other people, just because it doesn't go to the why. I mean, it does not attack the thing that really mattered to me. And so really it's just noise. It's not important.
Yeah, do you think someone's why is kind of like universal to all of their work, or is it something that has to be specific to each project?
That's a great question. I think there's going to be part of it in everything you do, but I could imagine, I mean, everybody's multifaceted, right? So they have different things. I really love history, and history is one of those things that I've always wanted to do more with in some form or fashion. And I've always incorporated it both into the stuff I wrote and into the podcast. I like bringing history into it. And I guess arguably that's a little different, because usually, not that there are no mysteries in history, there obviously are, but we like to think that history is basically what we believe it to be, and that we can trust that what we've been told happened. So it's more just sort of like I don't know. I honestly don't really know why I love history as much as I do. I just love history. So I guess if I ever did anything that was history based, the why would be a little different. But I do think we all are driven by certain things, and we all have passions. And I feel like most creators, what they do comes from the passion. Like whatever their passion is drives them, no matter how much, if somebody said, look, if you just do a romance, you'll make so much money. I don't know why that would be true, but just imagine somebody came to me and said, look, if you just write a romance novel, we'll pay you $5 million or something. That's great. That would be hard to turn down. And I'd probably have to write a romance novel at that point, but it would be really hard to do. And it probably wouldn't be very good. Right. Because that's just not that there's anything wrong with romance, but it's not something that I personally am really passionate about. And I think you see that there's a reason. Obviously, sometimes people get kind of pigeonholed into certain things, but I think there tends to be a reason that people focus on the things they do, because that's where their passion comes from. And their best work is always going to be, in my opinion, from that passion. Whatever their passion is, if they can channel that, into what they're creating, that's when you're going to get something beautiful.
I love that so much. Do you have a favorite episode that you've done, or a
So,
top 5?
my, it's funny because now we're I just talked about how there's not many mysteries in history, but my favorite episode, and this was more of a series, it was multiple episodes. There's something called Dyatlov Pass. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's a mystery from the Soviet Union, happened in the 1950s and 1959. I believe it was 9 hikers from very experienced mountaineers who were in college, went on this trek through the Ural Mountains. And it was it was a difficult hike, but not impossible, not super dangerous. No one expected anything to go wrong. The time comes for them to have come home and they don't show up. So there's a big search launched for them. And the searchers find just inexplicable things. They find their tent on the side of a mountain, but it's cut. There are cuts in the side of the tent. And they realize when they look at the cuts that they were made from the inside. So whoever did it cut the tent from the inside. There's no one there, though. And in fact, all of their stuff is still in the tent, their backpacks, their clothes, their shoes. So they find some footprints leading away from the tent. And they realize that these footprints are literally that, footprints. Only 1 or 2 of the people are wearing shoes. Everybody else is either in their bare feet or wearing socks. They follow them down. They end up finding a big fire and 2 bodies around the fire. Both of these people had died of hypothermia. They then realized that 3 people had apparently attempted to go back to the tent, and they find them, including Dyatlov, who was the leader of the group, and that's why it's called Dyatlov Pass. And then they find, months later, 3 more people in the bottom of a ravine with these really horrific injuries that no one can really explain. And no one has any idea how this happened to this day. And there's all these theories. I mean, the first theory was maybe it's an avalanche, but there are no avalanches in the area. There's a recent sort of quasi avalanche theory that some people buy. It goes Discovery just released a documentary on this, suggesting, I kid you not, that it could have been genetically modified Yetis created by the Soviets and or the Nazis that were in the area that killed these people. Who am I to judge, right? But there's other theories: Soviet weapons test, aliens, local tribes people. I mean, there's just all these theories, but none of them fit all the very bizarre circumstances of this. Like I said, they left all their stuff behind, but one of them's found with a camera around their neck. Like, why do you have a camera? One of them is found with a pad in their hand and a pencil, but they didn't write anything down. So like whatever they were going to write, who knows, right? So just this incredible mystery. And we basically applied the whole true crime approach to that, laying out the evidence, going through the timeline, talking about all these people. Didn't really reach a conclusion because how do you solve a 70-year-old mystery? But it was a lot of fun. And it's probably my favorite of all the 200 something episodes we've done. It's probably my favorite. Just, the others that are my favorite are the ones, there are episodes. One thing that's great about doing this and having sort of a larger audience at this point is being able to shine light on cases that nobody's ever heard of. So we like to do the big famous cases because that's what people want to hear, and that's great, and we want to do those. But we also intersperse them with stories of people who aren't focused on, and I'll just throw one out there for anybody who wants to look into it. It's a case, a young girl named Aisha Degree, young black girl from North Carolina, the kind of case where, unfortunately, I think if she was a white blonde girl from North Carolina, everyone would have heard of this case because it kind of blows your mind. And she, in the middle of the night, in a rainstorm, left her house for reasons no one can really understand. They find her backpack in a shed a few miles down the road. There's a witness who saw her getting into a car. It seems like probably what happened is some predator lured her into this circumstance and she disappeared. And then several years later, more of her items were actually found buried in a trash bag when they were building a house further down the road. So, but to this day, her family doesn't know what happened to her, and they've never been able to find her. And we've never been able to identify who did it. And it's one of those cases where it just feels like if this got more attention, maybe we could answer we could solve this mystery and we could give the family closure. So those cases I always really enjoy doing as well.
Wow, that's so interesting. I was like so enthralled that whole time. But in terms of writing and podcasting, what were your most important lessons that you've learned along the way that you think might have possibly changed how you approached it from the start?
That's a really interesting question. I think most of the lessons from podcasting, I think, have made the podcast better, but I don't know that they're big ones, because I think, honestly, maybe I should start with the writing experience, because I feel the writing experience was the first time I'd ever really done anything creative that I then threw out into the world. And like everybody, and like we just talked about, you live and die by your latest review, and you live and die by what people say about it. And I came to terms with the things we were talking about earlier, dealing with criticism, focusing on what it was that mattered to me, and who I wanted to be happy. When I was writing, I always wrote for one person. I think a lot of people do this, but as I'm writing, I think, well, what would this person, my wife, what would she think when she read this? Like, would she like this? Would she not like it? And so in some ways, if she liked it, success, right? But you're always going to get people who hate what you do. You're going to get people who think it's terrible. You're going to get people who criticize you. You're going to have ebbs and flows to success. You release a book, it's nominated for the Stoker Award, and then you're thinking, well, the next one I release is going to win it, right? And then, of course, nobody reads it. And so, but you have to keep going. And then eventually, you get nominated for another award, but you don't win that one either, and it's okay. It's an honor to be nominated. But you just, you have to remember why you're doing this. And I think that helped me when I went into the podcast, where the whole criticism thing, that wasn't a huge deal for me. If there were people, if it was just a complete flop, that was fine. Cut your losses and move on. But as long as there were people who were enjoying it and I was enjoying doing it, the criticism wasn't going to matter so much. I think the thing that surprised me the most about the podcast, and the thing that has been the most edifying, and I don't know if it would have changed anything about why we did it or how we did it, but it certainly would have made us more eager to do it, is the community that's sort of grown up around it. That has been really surprising. I always had hoped that people would listen to it and like it. I never expected for there to be groups of listeners who were talking about it, who became friends with each other and friends with us and support each other through things, and are a source of real positivity for each other. That I never could have imagined. And it's been such a blessing and one of those sort of really unexpected benefits. And that's another thing, if you're out there thinking about doing this, you always think about the negatives, right? You think about the criticism. You think about, what if it's a failure? You think about, am I really going to be able to do this? Am I really going to be able to put the time into it? But there are positives too. Beyond just the joy you're going to get out of it, there is, no matter how big a community it is, there is something about having people who listen or read or watch what you do, who it means something to them and it affects them. And that makes you feel really good in a way that a lot of jobs don't. I mean, most jobs, you never get the only positive reinforcement you ever get is your paycheck, which is great. You need that. But it's not like, your boss. I mean, maybe if you have a really good boss, he may tell you you're doing a good job every now and then. But, if you're working at the local, you're a waitress, how often at the end, you might get a tip, but how often does somebody tell you, you know what, you did a great job today. Thank you so much. That really meant something to me, the way you worked. That's just very rare, right? But when you're doing this, you will get that. There will be people who will do that, who will say those things to you. And that is, man, it's hard to beat that.
Yeah, actually, I have a lot of people ask me, how do I share my story so vulnerably? And I always tell them the same thing, that you have to care about that one person you could reach more than you care about the negative feelings you could get from hate or criticism. And I think that really goes back to your when you're talking about your ideal reader and would my wife like this? I think that's so powerful, because so much of the time It's so motivating to like kind of like write for someone or to create content for someone, or to know that someone's going to be impacted by what we do. And then just like the bonus of like being able to impact like strangers is just so powerful. And I have some communities, like a suicide prevention community, a community for creatives, and it's always like some of like the most meaningful things I do is like getting people together and realizing that like we're not alone in this journey. Specifically like the suicide prevention stuff, like we've run gratitude challenges, and like every time someone says like, oh yeah, like this challenge has like made a difference, it's just so meaningful. And I just think like how grateful I am that I've like overcome the criticism, because I am someone who's really sensitive. So a lot of the stuff you're saying, again, it's just so hard to not take notes. It's really gonna help my audience, I know.
Well, and I think, you mentioned suicide prevention, and you mentioned being vulnerable, and you mentioned things along those lines. I think two things I'll say. I mean, number one, if you're out there and you want to do this, or you want to do something like this, there are things you can do as a creative person where you maybe don't have to be as vulnerable. Like, I don't know, like writing, writing is a thing where you can put some separation between you and the reader. A lot of people use pen names. A lot of people try and maintain that separation. If you're doing something face to camera or voice and podcasting and that kind of stuff, I think you really have to be willing to be vulnerable, and you really have to be willing to be authentic, because people will see it. People know when you're being real with them, and they know when you're not, and they know when you're putting on, and people are looking for community so much. I think one thing that is so true today is a lot, maybe not all, but a lot of the traditional sort of communities that people relied on 100 years ago, we just don't have as much of, or they're falling apart, or people don't take part in them, civic organizations or religious organizations or whatever. There's just not as much where you feel like you are a part of something, where you feel connected to other people, where you feel like you can share the burdens of life with other people. There's just not as much of that out there as there used to be. And what is surprising to me, and what surprised me, and like I said, what was so gratifying, is the fact that you can create a community around something like a podcast that can do that, where people are able to come together, and they are able to connect, and they are able to share their struggles about really important things. People have reached out to us about suicide. People have talked to us about their struggles with depression. We talk about mental illness a lot. It's a true crime podcast, and mental illness often plays a huge role, and often is an understated factor. A lot of people, they want to look at cases, and particularly cases that have some sort of strange. We started our podcast started with Elisa Lam. We picked that case for a reason, because Elisa Lam is a young woman who was found in a water tank on top of a hotel, and there is some video of her in an elevator, which is very bizarre. And people took that and ran with it, and they created, serial killer theories and paranormal theories and possession and like all this other stuff. But the reality is, if you look at it, she very clearly was struggling with mental illness. And it was important to us to just start off saying, hey, we need to really tackle these things, because these things are important. And acting like this is some sort of like spooky paranormal thing, when in fact this is a young woman struggling with something. By focusing on that, by telling a real story, we can help other people. And we can make this tragedy that happened to her actually mean something positive, right? And I think supporting each other, and you talk about creators, we've talked a lot about listeners, but that is another important thing. If you're going to do this, find other people who are doing it, because it is bizarrely isolating. It is bizarrely isolating to talk to, if it goes well, you might be talking to thousands, tens of thousands of people every week. Hundreds of thousands of people if it goes really well, right? And yet you will feel alone. Like you will feel isolated, no matter how successful it is, because at the end of the day, you're talking into a microphone. It's like you can see those people, even if they send you nice notes and everything, and you will face challenges that you don't expect. And if you can find groups of other people who've done it, they can help you sort of get through that. I mean, a lot of creators face burnout. A lot of artists struggle with burnout all the time because they're trying to create something new and they're trying to create something better, and they put so much pressure on themselves to beat what they did before. And it can be really difficult. And people on the outside will not recognize that, and they won't understand it. And the only people who understand it are the people who are doing it. So I think the fact that you're doing that is really important. And I would encourage anybody who wants to do this, be a part of something like that.
I think community is just one of the most powerful things, just in general, that anyone can experience. Could you share some insights into your creative process? How do you come up with ideas for your horror stories and podcast episodes? And how do you develop them into compelling narratives?
So the podcast is easier because you don't have to make it all up. That's the problem with fiction is I don't know if I'm that creative a person, but I remember Stephen King was reading one of Stephen King's books about writing. Stephen King's written a lot of really great books about writing, and he was talking about The Mist, which is a short story he wrote that was turned into a movie. And he said basically he was standing in the checkout store and the register had gone down. So he's waiting in line at the register and forever. And he's looking at the plate glass windows. And he was like, what if there was like a prehistoric animal trying to get in and we're all stuck here in the supermarket with the register that doesn't work? And from that, he basically wrote this whole story. So look for sparks of inspiration if you're doing fiction. And don't let them get away, because the number of times I've had like a great idea and thought, man, I need to write that down, and then get ready to write it down. And I'm like, what was that again? I can't even remember. So just a practical thing. If you're out there wanting to do fiction, carry a notebook around with you and just jot this stuff down, because you never know what you might be able to spin out of something like that. When I wrote the way I did it, I think there are basically two big groups of people. There are people who outline everything they do, and there are people who just sit down and start writing. And I was more the latter. I would basically write a paragraph that laid out what the story was going to be, and then build that paragraph into whatever it was, whether it's a short story or a novel or a long fiction piece or whatever. I think finding your way to do it is really important. No one can tell you how you will do it, particularly when it comes to fiction. No one can tell you how you will do it, because every person is different. And if you try and do it the same way somebody else did, unless they just happen to be just like you and you luck into it, I think that's a recipe for failure. So people will say things like, if you're not writing every day, you're not a writer. Well, that's not true, or you got to write 1,000 words a day to be a real writer. No, when I did it, often I would write a page a day, which is actually not that much. But if you write a page a day for a year, all of a sudden you have a novel, right? So find what works for you, find what works for your schedule. We're all busy people. Most likely, especially the first thing you write, is not going to be your job. So you're probably going to have a job you're working. You might have, kids you're taking care of, or family members who need you. So figure out what works for you and try and be consistent. I think consistency matters, right? Like the thing for me was, it wasn't asking a lot to write a page a day. But if I did a page a day, which I did, then I would get it done. I think find something like that for you, and don't beat up on yourself when you miss a day is important. The podcast, like I said, great thing and the worst thing about true crime is there's always crime, and there's a lot of it. So we have listeners who are always suggesting stories for us. And when we started, I was like, what's going to happen when we run out of stuff to talk about? Never going to happen. Never going to run out of stuff to talk about. So the way we do it, we're lawyers. So if it's a legal case, we're pulling all the files we can, or reading the case file, or reading, if there's a trial, or reading the trial transcript, trying to distill that down for people who aren't lawyers and who don't have access or time to do all that. And then with the other things that aren't along those lines, just pulling all the resources we can. If there is some sort of police file, we can get our hands on it, great. If we can talk to somebody who's involved, fantastic. If the family, a lot of times the family is really eager to have someone do a story about their relative, because they recognize they want their case solved, and they know that media attention matters. And they've seen cases like the Gabby Petito case, where there was so much focus on that. And who knows if we ever would have found her body, and certainly as quickly as we did, had it not been that incredible amount of attention. And people see that. And so when you go to things like CrimeCon will be a lot of police officers, lawyers, podcasters, people in the field, but it's also a lot of victims and victims' families. And those people will often come to you and say, hey, can you take a look at my case? And we always try and do that. Always try and at least look into it and see, is there enough here to actually do something with? Because we want to be able to tell that story. So in some ways, the true crime podcasting creative aspect is really easy. You know, to tell a compelling story, I think, once again, it depends on what area you're in, you know, what exactly you're doing. If you're doing a fictional mystery podcast, your approach is going to be different than a true crime podcast. Like, we don't like to hide the ball. So we're not, you know, we don't make it mysterious for you. If we don't hide any of the evidence so it remains mysterious. Like, we lay it out for you in a timeline because we want you to be able to understand it and see exactly how things happened. Obviously, if we were doing a mystery podcast, it would do it differently. And so I think you just have to identify your audience, identify your goal, identify the story you're trying to tell, and craft it such that people can enjoy it, and don't worry about it. So there are people who will love what you do, and there are people who will hate it. If you do 20-minute episodes, there will be people who think it's too long, and there will be people who think it's too short. And if you do an hour-long episode, there will be people who think it's too long, and there will be people who think it's too short. And I think people try so hard to pigeonhole themselves into specific styles or specific time frames or whatever. And I think that's a mistake. Go be you. Just be yourself. Put yourself out there. Be authentic. And I promise you, you will find your people and they will find you.
I love that. So how has your experience as a lawyer impacted how you tell stories on the Prosecutors?
It's really valuable. And it really is. Because, and we talk about this sometimes on the show, there's all sorts of different lawyers. I worked for a big law firm for a while. It was terrible. I worked for judges for a while. I was an appellate lawyer for a while, and now I'm a prosecutor. And when you become a prosecutor, you know, those other places, you don't do as much trial work, or you're doing a lot more written stuff, and it's a different kind of storytelling. It's a different kind of law. But when you're going to be a prosecutor, you're going to have to be in front of people and juries, and you're going to tell them a story. And you're not writing, you know, when you're an appellate lawyer, the great thing is you're writing for judges. You know, you're writing for other lawyers. And so there's a certain way you can tell that story, and a way you can focus on things, and you know how they'll receive it. When you walk into court and you're going to try a case, and you got 12 people who could be anybody, most of them probably aren't lawyers. Lawyers probably got struck. They probably didn't end up on the jury, right? So you got people from every background, every educational level, every kind of work, you know, and it's not unlike the audience that you're going to be looking at one day when you start to release things. And you have to think, you've got these facts, and you've got the story you want to tell, and you want to convey certain information, and you want those people to reach a certain conclusion. And figuring out how to do that, just the similarities between what we do on the podcast has really been helpful, because I feel like so often when you look at a case, a true crime case, it's not unlike getting ready for a trial and getting ready to present a story to a jury. And everybody always says when you're in court, the best story wins. So you have to become a natural storyteller. You have to figure out a way to connect with people, and people who don't understand what you're doing and don't necessarily understand like all the sort of fancy legal parts of it. And I think that has just been incredibly far more valuable than I thought it would be. But really, once we got into it, I started to realize, wow, there is just so much overlap between what we're doing at work and what we're doing on the podcast.
So lastly, for those who may be new to your work, where can listeners and readers find your books and podcasts, and how can they connect with you online or on social media? And specifically, where exactly is your community? Do you have like places where people go, or any suggestions for people if they want to find other people who care about true crime or horror?
So all the novels are on Amazon. If you want to follow me, just me on Twitter, it's at Brett J. Talley. If you're looking for more of the podcast side, the Twitter podcast handle is at Prosecutors Pod. The community, I think the biggest community is on Facebook. It's called The Gallery because the people who, the area where you watch a trial from in a court is a gallery. And so that's what they call themselves. We didn't start it. They started it themselves. And it's gotten, pretty big at this point. There's a lot of people from a lot of different places. They've spun off all these other sort of subgroups. So if you're like somebody who really likes to cook, they have a cooking group. If you like dogs and cats, they have a pet group. It's a great group of people. I really love them. It's a good place. If you're looking to, and we're there all the time. It's a great place to talk about true crime or really anything you want to talk about. And then if you've got a case you want us to talk about, prosecutorspod@gmail.com. Shoot us an email. Let us know about it. And we promise we will take a look. And our website is prosecutorspodcast.com. And there you can find basically every case we've covered. And we always link to our various sources. So if we've covered the case and you want to read more about it, or you can't find a case file, a lot of times we're able to put the case file on there. So, you don't have to listen to us. You can just dive into it for yourself if that's something that interests you.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.